Welcome again. My name is Clenita Graffin-Reed. I work at the University of Washington Smart Center, and I'm so pleased to be able to facilitate today's training with you guys on, again, universal screeners. If you would, I do want you to direct your attention to the chat where my colleagues are putting some important information in there. You can download today's materials. There's a link for you to download the materials. And a reminder that all the materials in the recorded webinar will be posted here as soon as we are able to get it posted. All right. So before we get started into more of the training, we do want to take a time to have a land acknowledgement. The UW Smart Center and the Northwest MHTTC acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We are grateful to aim to respectively live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. We also want to acknowledge and honor the tradition land of the Confederate tribes of the Colville Reservation, the Cayuse, Palouse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Yakima peoples that we are on today. Again, this speaker series, which this is the second installment of our speaker series for the Northwest MHTTC, is brought to you by the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, and the University of Washington School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, also known as the UW Smart Center. I want to also remind you the recording and slide deck, again, will be posted on our event page as soon as possible. So if you enjoy the session and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I love for my colleagues to be able to have attended, please share with them the posting once it's on our website. So here is a graphic about the National MHTTC Network. Goals of the MHTTC Network are to accelerate the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices, also known as EBPs, to heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce, to foster regional and national alliances, and to ensure availability and delivery of publicly available, free of charge, training and technical assistance. So if you can see that the Northwest MHTTC is represented in the brown, but I'm so pleased to see that we have participants from the Region 10, which is the Northwest MHTTC. We have folks from South, Southwest, and someone from the New York area, which is Region 1. Okay, so let's tell you a little bit about the Smart Center. Well, we're a national leader in developing and supporting implementation of EVPs in schools, including the prevention, early intervention, and intensive supports. We do research and evaluation, training and technical assistance, and community partnering and outreach. And of course, about the Northwest MHTTC, we do all those things, again, focusing on the implementation of EVPs, building a multi-tiered system of support, training the workforce, and advancing the research base. And today, what you're here for, we're so excited. Today, we have our colleagues, Rayanne Silva, who works with me here at the UW Smart Center. We have Mary Metter, who is also, she's an implementation coach here at the UW Smart Center. Rayanne is a training and technical assistance coordinator and training unit coordinator of the UW Smart Center. And our LEA partner, Christy Sirigano, who is Wichita Public Schools. With no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to them to get started on a comprehensive universal screening, a statewide approach.
Good morning, afternoon to everyone. At the UW Smart Center, we do not just talk about wellness and mental health. We try to ensure that we foster it in everything that we do out in the field. One of those practices that we do is called a welcoming inclusion routine. And we always start with one of those to ensure that we create spaces that are safe and predictable, value everybody's voice, and create that sense of belonging. So the one we're going to do today is, oh, there we go. We are going to have you rate your current screening practice. So where you're currently at. All right, so a 1 is new. You're here to learn about universal screening. A 2 is we use existing data, things like ODRs, office discipline referrals, attendance, grades, to identify students who need students in need, but you don't use a formal screener. A 3 is you're starting to gather information and plan to implement a formal universal screener in the next year or two. And a 4 is you've started implementing a screener within the last year. And a 5 is you've been using a universal screener for 2 or more years, and you're here to just get a deeper understanding. So I'm going to have you in the chat rate where you're at, a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. All right. So we're going to start off with what we know about youth mental health. In 2020, Washington State actually declared a youth mental health emergency. There was a proclamation that was put out. And a year later, the U.S. Surgeon General did the same thing. They declared a youth mental health crisis. We're probably all aware of that. So what's the national state of youth mental health? We know that 1 in 5 have mental health problems that impact their learning. Suicide rates among Black youth have doubled since 2014. There's been a 33% rate increase in students reporting depression and anxiety since 2010. But what about Washington? Is it similar? Is it different? Is it higher? Well, in Washington, there's been an increase in youth that have been experiencing a major depressive order, and these data come from the Healthy Youth Survey. We've seen increases in students reporting feeling anxious and unable to stop worrying. We've seen some increases with suicide feelings and actions. Here's some data on whether or not students had an adult to turn to when they felt sad or hopeless. So what else do we know? We know that COVID really just exacerbated a problem that already existed. But we also know that mental health is shaped by a lot of factors. Some things that we have more influence over that we're able to mitigate, and some that we're not able to. Some of those factors are society, things like racism, media, technology. The U.S. Surgeon General actually just put out a new report about the impact of social media and technology on youth mental health. It's definitely worth a read. Environment, so things like housing security, access to healthcare, community, so your relationships with friends, families, teachers, the climate of your school, family, and then individual. So 4 of those 5, 3 or 4 of the 5, we have a lot of influence over. So what do we know about the impact, the potential impact that schools can have on youth mental health? Well, we know that there's an 11-year gap between onset and treatment of mental health disorders. And we know that students or youth are more likely to access services in schools than when we refer out. We know that school mental health is associated with positive mental health outcomes, and that research shows that school mental health services actually close that gap in accessing services for underserved and marginalized populations. If you want to read a little bit more about that, we actually put together a great brief. It's called The Case for School Mental Health, and it is aligned to the Washington MTSS framework. There's a QR code there. If you want to check that out later, it'll be in the slide deck. So what is Washington doing to support school mental health at a systems level? Well, in 2014, there was some initial legislation that was put out for schools, districts to authorizing state legislation for screening. If you weren't aware, here is the actual RCW that is out. So it says, Schools shall develop a model school district plan for recognition, initial screening, and response to emotional or behavioral distress in students, including but not limited to substance abuse, violence, and youth suicide. In 2021, the auditor did an audit of everything that was happening in schools related to that legislation. And here are some of their findings. So they found that universal screening, it's the basic foundation for behavioral health systems. However, not very many students were being screened. You see 41% of students were not being screened at all. 14% were just screening a subset of students, and only about 19% of educational organizations were screening all kids. So they found that behavioral health supports, they depend on what schools are able to provide at the local level, meaning there really wasn't a system that supported down the pipeline. And that our state's approach was really fragmented and lacked the resources to provide comprehensive mental health. So in 2022, OSPI developed in collaboration with actually the UW Smart Center and Forefront Suicide Prevention, a model district template for installing universal screening. Some of the recommendations that came out of that report directly for OSPI is that it needed to revise the district plan template to more closely follow those state requirements. And to achieve this, we needed to develop a broader understanding of emotional or behavioral distress beyond suicidality. It was really narrowly defined with that substance abuse and suicide, and then develop better systems of communication. If you want to check out that model template, we have a QR code here for you. And again, it will also be in the slide deck. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Mary.
Okay, thank you. What is universal screening, right? A lot of work has been being done in partnership with the UW Smart Center and OSPI around helping develop this model template that districts can use and follow to help at least have some sort of system and plan to follow for universal screening. But what we've also learned is that there is a need for increased understanding on what it is. So I'm going to dive into that. And what I want us to do is first think about when we go to a doctor, essentially, we wouldn't just go to a doctor and go immediately into seeing them. They're going to do some format or some type of screening. And that might include taking our temperature. It might include getting our weight and our height checked, our blood pressure and our heart rate monitored, and potentially an order of different labs to kind of get a more whole child, if you will, picture of what's going on so that we can look a little bit deeper. And that's essentially what universal screening is. It's not something that we use in isolation to help route a student to intervention. When we use screening data in isolation, what we often see is that those data can be weaponized and can lead to labeling, stereotyping, different assumptions, right? Over-identification of students who are already being pushed to the margins. And so it's important for us to use these data to get a more whole child view and to use them with other detection methods. It's not something that we want to use for diagnostic purposes, prescriptive or evaluative purposes, such as using them on report cards or using them during for grading purposes. We wouldn't want to use those data for this at all. Instead, we want to look at universal screening or systematic screening. We use those terms interchangeably as a proactive approach for helping identify students who might need more support beyond tier 1. And we want to do this at the earliest signs of concern before symptoms take place. There are a lot of different key features that I'm going to review, but some that stand out for us that need to be at least considered when it comes to implementing universal screening is that, one, it's universal. It's for all students who are attending your school. Next, it's repeated 3 times a year. A lot of times we get asked, okay, well, why wouldn't we just screen during the fall and winter? Because in the spring, they're getting ready to go to summer. We would never say something like that for academics. So we really shouldn't approach a student's social, emotional, behavioral, mental health that way either. We should be screening 3 times a year. That's what's best practice. And we want to screen in the spring, say that 10 times over and over, with enough time for a 4 to 6 week intervention to be put in place if necessary. Next, it's proactive, right? It's used not only to help identify students who might need tier 2 and tier 3 supports, but we also use it to examine the overall level of students' performance, right? And the overall health of our system. And last but not least, it's psychometrically sound. We use a reliable and valid tool, right, for our intended population. Beyond some of the reasons that Rayanne talked about as to why we should be screening using this proactive approach is one, it enhances our comprehensive continuum of supports. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the PBIS triangle or the MTSS triangle, right? Screening is a core component of PBIS and MTSS. And so Dr. Kurt Hatch often says we shouldn't be doing PBIS light, right? There's no such thing as that. We need to be implementing it to full fidelity, right? We need to make sure that our MTSS is the same, that we're implementing it to full fidelity, which includes comprehensive universal screening. Next, it also helps identify students' strengths and their needs, depending on which tools we're using, right? It improves access to and benefit from mental health services. It helps us make more economically sound decisions, right? The old way of universal screening used to be that we would use things like office discipline referrals, attendance, grades, maybe wellness checks with the counselor, right? But when we use those data points, it's giving us a very limited view of what's going on in our system. So I think about it, if we use only office discipline referrals, think of a safety net, and our safety net might only be this big, right? But when you add in other components to that screening, including maybe a systematic referral process where teachers, students, family members, and community members are able to request additional assistance, it widens that safety net a little bit. And then when we add in this screening, it actually makes our safety net a lot wider. And that's because when we're screening for certain things that these valid and reliable tools offer, we're able to catch a lot more students from falling through the cracks, and we're able to identify them earlier, right, at earliest signs of concern. Last, it's also required by Washington state law, which Rayanne talked about, right? It is actually a law for us to be doing to have a plan for universal screening within our districts. So I talked a little bit about the PBIS or MTSS light and how universal screening is a core component of that. Well, in order to make sure that we're doing this right, I just wanted to review this briefly, that essentially we should have a continuum of supports for our students when we're screening, right? That includes our tier 1, which are systems, practices, and data that we're looking at in order to serve all students, all staff, in all settings school-wide. We know that these supports really should serve and be effective for about 80 to 85% of students. But even if we're doing tier 1 really well, we know that about a 10 to 15% population of students is still going to need these secondary or tier 2 supports, right? This is where we add in maybe small groups or check in, check out. Even if layering on to tier 1 for tier 2 is done really well, we know that about a small population, 1 to 5% of students, will still need specialized, individualized interventions that are going to help them be successful and supported in their school environments, right? And what you see on the side of this in white writing is as we move up the tiers of support, we are seeing that we need increased resources to do this, right? More staff, more time, more data to look at. It's why it's so important for us to put a lot of our effort into this tier 1 basket. We want to make sure that we have a strong foundation so that we don't overwhelm our tier 2 and our tier 3 system. And something that's always important for us to talk about is our language. When we're thinking about universal supports, tier 2 or tier 3 supports, the tiers are essentially just that. They're just service delivery of supports. So we don't label students as a tier 2 kid or a tier 3 student, right? We want to make sure that we're saying this student might need tier 3 supports in math, but they might need tier 1 supports in social, emotional, behavioral, right, systems. So we want to make sure, Christy talked to me earlier about how she looks at this as we want to use empowering language. And it's not empowering our students to say that this kid is a tier 3 kid. So just anytime that you're working with your peers, I challenge you to call that out into the space. We don't want to label and perpetuate stereotyping amongst our students. Now, going back to what we can learn from a universal screener, I already talked about this a little bit. We can learn to what extent is our tier 1 supporting all students, right? Do we have a triangle that looks like this when we get our screening data back, where it says, ooh, only 45% of our students are responding to tier 1 supports, and 45% need tier 2 and 10% need tier 3. This is an overwhelmed system, and it's going to feel very overwhelming to your staff, right? And it's going to feel like we're constantly putting fires out. So we need to make sure that we're using these screening data to not only identify students who need tier 2 and tier 3 supports, but that we're using it to go back and look at our tier 1 and make sure that we have a strong foundation so that, right, we're being more proactive, which means that we can actually take our screening data and not only refine our tier 1, right, when we get those data back, but we can also use it to identify early, right, and also prevent issues from becoming more intense and needing more individualized supports. The saying used to go, don't screen unless you can intervene. And actually, we've shifted that language a little bit. It's we can always intervene, and we must be doing this in a time, right, of a mental health crisis where we're able to kind of identify students at the earliest signs of concern and also go back and strengthen our tier 1 so that we're seeing less students who might need those advanced tier supports. Now, when it comes to looking at what we screen for, you'll notice here that it says, yes, we should be screening for students who might have externalizing and internalizing behaviors, right? Those being what we kind of classify as risk, meaning externalizing behavior might be office discipline referrals, right? Maybe there's kicking or other types of externalizing behavior, and internalizing being something like shy, disengaged, quiet, right? Those are important, right? Screening for risk is important. But when we think about mental health, it's not simply the absence of psychological difficulties. So when we screen, it used to be that best practice was screening for internalizing and externalizing behaviors, or what we would classify as risk, right? Or social emotional behavioral problems, I guess, or I wouldn't say problems, challenges. But now we've come a long way with universal screening, and more recent research shows that actually we need to be taking this dual factor approach, where we're not only screening for risk or internalizing and externalizing behaviors, but we're also screening for protective and promotive factors, right? This balance between both risk factor and protective factors is actually more in accordance with recommendations from more recent research, right? The field of screening has grown a lot, and recent research tells us that we should be having a dual factor screening approach where we're not only screening for internalizing and externalizing behaviors, because this research has suggested that pro-social behavior and problem behavior each uniquely predict student behavioral outcomes and are really important in supporting early identification of behavioral and emotional risks. So it's no longer essentially best practice to only screen for internalizing and externalizing behavior. And when you think about internalizing and externalized behavior, really what we see are symptoms. These are symptoms of something else below the surface that's going on, right? So when we're only screening for risk factor, it means just because we have the absence maybe of risk, it doesn't equal wellness or the presence of positive emotional state, which means that it's not synonymous with complete mental health. And yes, while screening for risk factor is important, it's not the only thing we should be screening for, because it gives us a very limited view of mental health within our community. And it only gives us the ability to identify students when a symptom has already occurred, which means this actually isn't that proactive. But when we look at the research, what we're actually seeing is that when students have the presence of well-being that you see defined here in the purple section, right, which are those protective and promotive factors, we actually see that those students have increased outcomes, right, like academic attitudes, identity development, perceptions of overall physical health and social support, and satisfaction with their relationships. Which means that if we can screen for protective and promotive factors and identify students who aren't experiencing well-being at a very early stage, we might be able to limit students who are then going to experience risk later down the road. So just a couple of key takeaways from this mental health continuum is that yes, screening for risk factor alone, it's no longer best practice. It gives us a very limited understanding of mental health. It's still important, but we should be having this dual factor approach where we can help detect students at an earlier stage before the need, right, of these risks developing. So when it comes to completing the screener, it's really important that we're centering equity in this work. And it's really important that, yes, it used to be that teachers would complete this, right? It's not diagnostic, prescriptive, or evaluative, like I said. And sometimes when we have teachers who fill out the screener and use those data in isolation, what we often see is bias can come out in that, right? So yes, while it's a very important view to have teachers complete the screener, we want to have this multi-informant approach where teachers can complete a component of a screener, our students are able to complete a component of the screener, and family members and caregivers are also able to do this. And this might seem really overwhelming. How are we going to have a data system that can support a multi-informant approach where we have all three of these data sources to look at? Well, start with two of them. Can we at least start with students and make sure that their voices are heard? Because if we're only looking at teacher data, we have other data sources to maybe confirm those biases, right? Like office discipline referral data, attendance. We can confirm it with those, but we want to make sure that we have multiple voices that are being heard. So some more critical features to universal screening that I want to review. I'm going to ask you to use the chat I'll name a feature, and then I want you to tell me if you think that that feature is more likely to increase the likelihood of promoting positive outcomes, or if you think that feature is going to likely increase the likelihood of causing harm or negative impact. So I'll read a feature starting with the first one, and then go ahead and use the chat. Selecting a tool that screens for a specific diagnosis or using for diagnostic purposes. Is this feature going to increase the likelihood of harm, or is it going to increase the likelihood of promoting positive impact? Yeah, if you said that it's going to increase the likelihood of harm, you're right. Remember, it's not something that we should be used for diagnostic purposes. It's a universal screening data that helps us get a more well-rounded view of what might be going on and helps us to be able to look at other data sources to confirm whether a student might need an additional support. Key feature number 2, supported and informed by youth and family. Yeah, increases the likelihood of promoting positive outcomes. This is that multi-informant approach where we're not only just having teachers screen for students, right? We know that that can increase our biases, right? And we might see things like over-identification. I mean, we might not, but likelihood, we might see over-identification of certain populations, and we want to make sure that our students are able to have their voices heard and the supports that they might need. Key feature number 3, monitors the social, emotional, behavioral health, like well-being and problems, or risk and protective and promotive factors. If you said that this increases the likelihood of promoting positive outcomes, you are correct. This is that dual factor screening approach, right? Where we're not only measuring or monitoring for internalizing and externalizing behaviors, but we're also going to screen for protective and promotive factors as well. What about assesses for suicide or self-harm using a single item? If you said that this is going to probably increase the likelihood of harm or negative impact, you're correct, right? We don't want to assess for one specific thing, especially using one specific item, right? That's not what universal screening is for. Universal screening is to get a more, it's a more systems level approach to identifying students who might need supports. What about uses teacher, parent, or student nomination data in isolation? If you said that it increases the likelihood of causing harm or negative impact, you're correct, right? We don't want to just use one single data point to help identify students who might need supports or to help make decisions. We want to have a multi-informant approach, and we want to make sure that we're using other detection methods as well. What about uses for high stakes decision-making? Things like report cards. Yeah, this would increase the likelihood of harm or negative impact. We don't want to use this as a referral or a report card decision-making, right? Now, When it comes to high stakes decision making, for me, when I think of high stakes decision making, I guess I think of more like a district team might use these data to reallocate funding, right? We might say, ooh, this data is showing that we need more mental health supports in the school, so we're going to reallocate funding to help support systems and practices for that, right? So that's a little bit different than using it for things like report cards and referrals. And I'll just go over the last two for the sake of time. Using data to inform continuous problem solving across the continuum of supports, right? Like we use these data to help monitor our tier 1 and our instructional supports. That's likely to increase positive outcomes. Same with using to identify students who might benefit from early social, emotional, behavioral interventions and supports before we reach that level of crises. That's what these data are used for. Here's a more comprehensive list. We pulled out the ones that we felt were pretty important and that we wanted to identify. The resource that we pulled these from is the best practices in social, emotional, and behavioral screening, which is actually an implementation guide. If you haven't read it, it's very helpful. It's been used to help inform some screening modules that we've developed and is an excellent tool. So that resource is titled down here. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Christy Greenaway Siriano with our LEA Partner District.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christy Greenaway Siriano. I've had the privilege of working for Tacoma Public Schools for about 8 years now, and been working on screening. We're going to share a little bit of our journey in Tacoma. You can see some of our stats there. We absolutely have the most amazing educators and the most brilliant students in Tacoma. We have some areas of growth for sure as a school district, as you can see, and I'll share some of our info about screening. I could go on and on about why we screen, but I think the two main points that I'll share, because I have been known to go on and on about why it's important to screen, is kind of mirroring what Rayanne had shared about some concerning data, that we have concerning data around our students from a healthy youth survey, from our climate survey, from other pieces of data. And I feel like we're morally obligated to intervene earlier, that we want to intervene before we get to this data, like from our healthy youth survey, 10% of our high school students had said that they had attempted suicide. We want to be able to intervene before there's a level of crisis like that. And Mary, can you click one more time? We want to define success in school more than just academics, right? We know it's not just, did you get an A in science, although that's important. It's mutually beneficial to also assess and consider the well-being of the student, the social emotional learning skills of the student, the environment within the school, because they're mutually beneficial. They help support academics. And we know we wouldn't say a student is successful if they just get good grades, but they're struggling in other areas. There we go. So our journey in Tacoma of screening has been a long and winding road. There is probably too much text on this, but what you need to know, it's a continuous improvement process. We definitely don't have everything figured out, but I want to share a little bit of our journey. Some of the things that have grown or changed over that long and winding road are things like shifting from prioritizing adult perceptions to student report. Like Mary mentioned, we want to prioritize student voice and hear directly from the students things that are going on. So our screener that we're using is a student perception, a student screener that they take. And we've really moved from using it to identify students, which students need additional supports. We've moved to, we can use this screener to identify the needs in our systems. How is our tier 1 systems and supports, our practices, how are they supporting students? Are they supporting a variety of groups of students? Are they supporting our students overall? And then using that screening data to strengthen or adjust has been a shift. And we want to have consistency, build consistency across both for knowledge, but also use of data in screening across our district. Some things that have been consistent, you see on the bottom, we know teams are important. I'm sure you all are focused on building teams because we know that's where the kind of the magic happens, right? Long-term sustainable change happens through team-based implementation. So we've prioritized that both at the district level, thinking about what is the screener going to be, identifying that and those kinds of things, but also really important at the school so that it's not dependent on one single person to intervene or to do the logistics of screening. So it's all about teams. We've strengthened definitely the foundation of equity, but we know everything we do needs to have that foundation of equity and use an equity lens. And I'll share what we've used this year in a little bit. Obviously, continuous improvement, we're always making adjustments and improving. That our work is paired with ongoing coaching and professional development. We have the privilege of having a variety of whole child coaches, but also some data coaches in our district. We're very lucky to have. And we've really prioritized integrating screening into our systems. So rather than having it as an outside thing, we want to be able to like look at data next to each other. We want to have it within the things that we're already using. Some of the considerations that we used when selecting our screeners have been the cost. We know that it costs a lot of money and you have to have ongoing funding to sustain. So we need to consider the cost of the screener, but also how are we going to pay for that cost? Like I said, we want to have a student report screener, and we want to be able to look at the scores alongside other data points. So not screening in isolation, but we want to look at that along other data, the ODRs, the discipline, the attendance, other academics, all of those things to get a full picture of our students and not just rely on one single data point. So some of our systems and practices that have helped us with continuous improvement, like I said, teams are important. We've had a district work group, varying variations over the years. Our most recent work group had a variety of folks from across the district, folks from buildings, from our partners at UW-T, to help us select our screener, work on the logistics, some supports for buildings so that our, more than 50 schools don't have to make it up on their own, but they have some supports in the facilitation of and the use of data, and that team with extensive knowledge is also learning and growing together. This is one of the articles, the Equity by Design article, that we found helpful, that our team has read and reflected on. There's 7 key takeaways. It's a relatively short read, a quick read, but has some really deep suggestions that you can unpack either as a school team or a district team. Things like it should be used in a comprehensive integrated approach. So in that multi-tiered system of support, you're not just screening to identify tier 2, but it's within that whole system, and to, understand the limitations that screening can't be used in isolation. So there's some really great learning. So I'd highly recommend the reading of that article. Like I said, some of the other things that team has done is create some district-wide support. So having a calendar where people can see the windows, but also upcoming professional learning around screening. There's technical support. There's example communication. So we want to make sure that our families and our students and our staff are all really well informed, that they know what screening is, why we're doing it, how the data is going to be used. So there's some language that our schools can take and use in their own robocalls or their newsletters or those kinds of things, as well as a language for an opt-out form. We want to have families and students the opportunity to opt out if they don't feel comfortable taking the screener. And so giving schools the language that they can use for that, I think can be helpful. And there's a facilitation guide that the team created that I'll talk about in a minute. And we know that every school is at a different implementation stage. Just like you all, some of you were at exploration, maybe you're considering a screener, all the way to you've already done a screener for a few years. Our schools are in similar stages, and we can't skip that exploration stage, because if we do, sometimes we have to go back and repeat it. People don't understand the reasons. They feel like it's just one more survey, it's just one more data point. We have so many data points. So it's going intentionally through those implementation stages so that you can build a stronger system. And we've really started small. As we've had new iterations, we pilot with just a few schools that are willing so that we can build, improve, make adjustments to, and add in additional schools. And we've had some professional development for groups of people, but also for teams specifically to build their capacity and that's paired with coaching. We're in the process of building some video series for our schools so that it's not just come to a training, but you can access the information and build capacity, build your knowledge base at any time, from why we screen to preparing for it, the logistics, or using the data. So there'll be a resource bank that teams can access, so anyone at a school can access and kind of better understand screening, because there's a lot to learn and lots to unpack and think through and reflect to make it make sense for your system. Along with that available resource, there's team-based training. And one of the first things that teams need to think about is how universal screening fits into their current data profile. Because like I said, it can feel like just an extra piece of data, and you can use other data points to screen. But like Mary was saying, it is another important place that you can help be more proactive, that you can see places of struggle and concern, but also positive aspects, protective factors. And that's been really important for us with universal screening. And it can be looked at the tier 1 level and to identify needs at tier 2. Like I said, professional development goes through some logistics of like, how do we use this screener? What are the logistics around that? But also is important to reflect on, what are your current systems? What do you do for tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3? So that way, when you get the screening data back, you can have a better picture of what are the things that we might need to strengthen, that we don't need to necessarily add on additional thing, but maybe we need to strengthen something that we're already doing. Maybe we need to do something with more fidelity. So part of our preparing to use a screener is not just the logistic piece, but that reflection. And that can look pretty simple. We have right now this, what do you do at tier 1? And a conversation around, what have we committed to as a staff? What have we agreed upon? These are the practices we're going to use school-wide in our classrooms. And are they being done with fidelity? Because sometimes we say we're going to greet students at the door, but it's not really happening. We need to uncover that, because then when we get the screening data back, we can say, oh yeah, we're working on that. Or there's this gap, we're going to add something in here. We're going to just adjust how we do. We're already doing circles or morning meetings. We're going to adjust what we're doing in those circles to better meet our needs, better meet the needs of students. So before screening, a reflection at the team-based or school-based level of like, what are we doing and how well? And then also at tier 2, so that we can have a clear picture, what are the interventions that we can route to meet the needs of students? And are there gaps? Are there, even without screening data, can we strengthen our tier 2 systems and practices? And what's the capacity there? Because we sometimes get concerned we're going to identify a greater need than our capacity. So having a realistic look at what our capacity is an important step. So moving from preparing to screen to during screening, we have some tech support available, coaches and assessment folks. There is a facilitation PowerPoint that work group put together for teachers to use when they're facilitating screening with students, that has a little video about why we're screening so that they're well aware what's happening. It has some information about confidentiality, who's going to see your data, what the data is going to be used for, and consent. There's instruction and navigation tips, defining some words that students have struggled with in the past. And it also has some follow-up activities, which is relatively new for us, but I think it's really exciting that instead of just, okay, students take a screener, go back to academics, that we take a moment to pause, to reflect, there's some options for teachers to do some kind of calming activities if we feel like emotions are heightened or things are heightened, or some energizing activities if, after they've done the survey, that they're needing some boost before getting back to academics. And the opportunity to provide feedback, because it is a continuous improvement process. We want to improve our systems over time. It's not just well, we figured it out and now move forward. And then following screening, we provide some additional coaching and development. I think that's where it's tricky, is like, how do we use this data in meaningful ways to help support triangulating it with other data, and really determining, do we need to support the system or do we support the students? And what's the balance in that? How do we adjust our systems to better support our students? And we do that through kind of a process, this graphic, where you can think through, based on the data, are we supporting at least 80% of our students with our current tier 1 supports. So they'd be rated low concern on our screener. Are we meeting at least 80% of students' needs currently? And if not, instead of jumping to additional interventions for students, we can adjust our systems, our current practices school-wide. And if it's meeting 80% at a school-wide level, maybe it's looking at grade levels. Maybe it's 8th grade, maybe it's 4th grade that we're not meeting all of the students. Maybe it's some other group of students that our current tier 1 systems and practices aren't meeting. So we can intervene at that level or classroom level, and then we can move to tier 2 interventions and meeting the needs of more individual students. We also have that parallel urgent response. We have a couple questions we've added to our research-based screener that has things like, would you like to set up time to talk to a trusted adult, for example? And we want to respond to that relatively urgently. If they want to talk to an adult, we're going to set up a time for them to talk to an adult. So there's a few of the questions that we added kind of in addition to the research one that we have a system, schools create systems to respond to more urgently. Another way to see the same graphic is this kind of flow chart of like, where do I need to intervene? Am I intervening at a school-wide level or individual classroom level? Maybe I just need to adjust what the current plan is. So we're making decisions, but before we finalize our decisions in anything, we're working to really use this anti-racist pause, which is a list of questions that can help us literally pause and take a moment and make sure that our decisions, but also our language and personal interactions and things like that is anti-racist, because we know it's not enough to be just not racist. We want to be actively anti-racist in the decisions we're making that influence our students' lives. So we want to pause and make sure we've, for example, understood the historical context before we finalize our decision, or who's at the table, seek to understand who's been involved in this discussion, whose perspective have we partnered with or considered before we just rush to, that sense of urgency. We need to support students, but we often pausing and being helpful to make helpful decisions, as opposed to a decision that could potentially be harmful if we didn't intentionally take a moment to pause and reflect. So this is something that we're using with screening data, but also just kind of generally we're working to use more regularly throughout the district. It's been really positive, beneficial. And like I said, we've not been without our challenges and barriers, probably like many of us. Obviously, COVID was a big challenge and barrier, but we've encountered a variety of other ones as well. For sure, technical concerns. We've prioritized building it into our own platform, into something that's integrated into what we're already doing. And we consistently come up with barriers around that. So we've prioritized it, but it's also come with its own challenges and concerns that have come in a variety of ways. That it's just that continuous improvement. If this is what we want to do, we need to figure out how to work through some of these barriers and to try to that's part of starting small and expanding, so we can problem solve not at the almost 60 school level, but at the few 5-10 schools at a time, or one school at a time. We've also had some challenges around people concerned that it's a trauma screener. This is not a screener for ACEs at all. So we've worked to both better understand it at the district level, but also to help understanding more broadly around what universal screening is and how it's different than if someone was screening for ACEs or for trauma. There's also been concerns about or barriers around, is our consent the correct do we need permission slips to have students participate in the screener? And so we've really worked closely. Our legal team is great, and they've worked with us to make sure that our type of questions, it's okay to have active, passive, or not active, informed passive consent, but also that the overall, it's voluntary. You can opt out. You can also opt out of individual questions. If a student feels like they feel uncomfortable answering a specific question, that they're not required to submit an answer before they move on. So that way we can inform. We absolutely want to inform students what it's about, families what it's about, but then gain passive consent so we don't have to file a permission slip with each student. And then a barrier that I feel like, aren't we all feeling this in a variety of ways? I feel like it's talked about a lot. It's just like feeling overwhelmed. And screening can feel like, it's going to come back with so much concern. I know there's a high level of need for my students. And there's been some kind of resistance or worry about it's going to overwhelm our capacity. We're not going to have enough capacity to meet this. We're not going to have enough small groups to meet the needs of our students. And we have found that we haven't had enough tier 2 interventions, enough small group time, enough counseling time, enough partnerships but instead of thinking about we just going to intervene our way out of the issues of how do we change our systems, our tier 1 practices? How do we change what's happening in the classroom? Not by necessarily adding more in, like I said, but just adjusting, strengthening, doing things with more fidelity so we can better meet the needs of students in the classrooms that they're already in with the teachers that they're already at. So rather than being overwhelmed by a potential tier 2 issue, it's changing our thinking about how we're using the data. I probably more challenges and barriers too that I haven't shared, but so just know that we're just like all of you probably. Some of the key learnings is, again, the need to consider the whole child. We're the whole child department, but screening can be just one-dimensional of a student. And we know that our students aren't one-dimensional, they're multi-dimensional. We need to consider professional judgment on the teachers. We need to consider the student story, other factors, other data points. We've also created, like I said, some questions, and it's been a long road to adjust the questions to be something that's useful. We've used a research validated tool, but we've added some questions, but those questions have taken a lot of time to adjust in ways and then use them in ways that are helpful. We always can learn more. Absolutely. It's really important to slow down, use that pause to better understand student needs, to better understand staff needs, but to slow down and implement in intentional ways. And then always the ongoing need to strengthen teams at all levels. It can't just be one single person, but to build the knowledge, the capacity, the willingness, that ongoing need to strengthen teams. That I'm sure we're all there, but we got to have teams both at schools to help implement and at the district level as well. Okay. Thank you so much for letting me share. That's my spiel. I'll turn it back over to Mary or Rayanne.
Okay, thank you. We are in the Q&A stage, so I'm gonna read out questions and then hopefully we as a team can tackle them. One question that I'm seeing in the chat is, what specific tool does Tacoma use? I would highly recommend before asking for a tool that we make sure that we identify a need that we're trying to address first. So that's often the question we get asked first in any training we do or any conference we present at is, what tool did you use or what tool do you recommend? There are so many validated tools out there, and it really depends on the need of your community. So before, it can be helpful for Christy to share the tool they use, of course, but also the tool that they're using they might have selected that tool for a very specific need for their district, and it might not be the same as your need. So I really have a lot of concern about sharing a specific tool, because first, what we need to do is identify the need that we have in our community for screening and what gap we're trying to address. And then there's a whole list of universal screeners that are out there. And I would just recommend first addressing that need. Is there anything Christy or Rayanne would add to that?
I think, and there's a list, I think, in the OSPI, and you both would know more, in the OSPI model template. I think it goes through asking you some of those questions of like, what is the purpose of screening for you and that you feel is important? And then I think in one of the appendixes, like, and here's some possible, am I thinking of a different thing, or the OSPI
Yeah,
model template?
and that will be available in the QR codes that Rayanne had shared earlier. So I would just, before we were working with a partner district who said, well, let's just ask our partner or the district that's right next to us what tool they're using for screening, and we can select that because it means that we have a very similar community that we're serving, which means it would work for us. The problem is if you select a tool that is based off of a different need, it's not going to solve any problems, and then that's going to cause a false start within your organization. And a false start is not neutral for everyone, right? So we just want to make sure that we're addressing that need first. And Christy, great recommendation to go back to that model template. I see.
I also think CI3T, is that the right acronym?
Oh yeah, CI3T.
Has a
Yep.
whole like
Another good website.
information, what it does, has a little sample of things, some videos around that, has lots of great information too. So
Yep. CI3T.
Northwest MHTTC also has a like screening 1-2 pager with, I think it's the exact same list of tools that you'll find on definitely OSPI, but probably a lot of the similar ones that you'll find on CI3T. And I would offer, in addition to like what's the need and what's the purpose, bringing together some sort of a district leadership team alongside your families and students. Like, what is it that you value? What are we already collecting? What's important for us to know? Mary and I were working with a district somewhere, I don't remember where, and there was this concern over like non-native English speaking families and how they interpret the items. And like, they stumped me there. I was like, it's a valid, reliable tool, but so yeah, having your community vet those items. If you're gonna be culturally responsive, it needs to be done alongside. If I didn't already say it, like what data are you already collecting and how do you hope to use this? Will the interface be with, the teacher or so yeah, going through that process is far more important. Will ensure you're not doing harm than it is just to know like what the best tool is, because there's a ton of best tools out there.
And it centers your community when you do that, which I think is most important. And like Rhiannon said, when they asked us that question, we were both the researchers and us, but both went to like, well, just find a tool that's valid and reliable for your community. And she was explaining to us, but this language doesn't make sense to the families that we're serving. And I was like, yeah, you're right. So it's better to bring people in and then to have further conversations and dialogue about that. I appreciate that. If you want to learn more about screeners, we have our contact information. I'll list that at the end or maybe now, just so that if anyone needs our contact information, we're happy to talk to you about it. Rhiannon and I, we're working with a lot of different districts on tool selection. But again, we like to kind of push on you a little bit to see what that need is, what your community looking like, what systems do you have in place. Another question I see is, how has your team developed an assessment worksheet to structure similarity of assessing the students with the same wordage? Charlie, I don't know that I quite understand that question. How I'm reading that question is, one, it's always important to have some sort of assessment worksheet where you're listing out, like what Rhiannon just talked about. What's the data that we're already collecting? Do we have a climate survey? Do we have an SEL assessment tool that we're using? Office discipline referral data, attendance, grades, wellness checks, right? Listing out the data you're already collecting, the purpose it serves, and then seeing where there's overlap and where there might be gaps in your system is really important. But if I'm answering that wrong, please feel free to type more in the chat. One question is, one struggle we've had here at the high school level is the size of our high school, 1,500 students. Yeah, and the limited resources, one social worker, one therapist, overloaded school counseling team. I'm curious what tier 2 interventions you have tried and had success with to alleviate the strain on tier 3 resources. Christy or Rhiannon?
Well, I think Christy, or maybe it was Mary, maybe both of them, touched on it a little bit. One of the benefits of universal screening is it allows us to turn that, what we historically have thought of as an upside down triangle, turn it right side up. So it allows us to assess our core and have more of our students, their needs being met in that core instruction. So I know that doesn't exactly answer the question about interventions, but I think you'll find you'll have less need at the tier 2 and tier 3 levels.
Yeah, I appreciated what Christy said. She showed that diagram that had the arrow and then the 4 squares, where it's first examine your system, right? And then go and examine what students might need tier 2. And I think, Christy, you had showed too a tier 2 intervention map, right? And there are things that you can look at online, like What Works Clearinghouse, the National Center for PBIS has interventions listed. And I think one key thing is, what do you already have in place? And then doing kind of an assessment. Is it evidence-based? Is it being done to fidelity? Because a lot of people will say things like, oh, you know, check and check out doesn't work, or this small group doesn't work. Well, you have to look at all of the system pieces and make sure that those core features are being implemented to fidelity as well.
I
Yeah,
also will say, sorry.
go ahead.
I'll also add, when we think about tier 2 interventions, we often think of really complex things that might be more like a tier 3 individualized support. And tier 2 can be simple, or maybe it's like a 1.5 tier intervention. I've seen schools based on screening data assign every single person in the building that's maybe willing to, or maybe every single person, a 2x10, which is a research-based practice, can be used just in your classroom when you're struggling to build a relationship, or when you're needing something extra for a student. That's 2 minutes a day for 10 days in a row. And if every student or every teacher has 1 or 2 students that they're practicing 2x10 with, it can be really impactful for those students to have an additional adult on their side, an additional relationship, additional person that's looking out for them. And that can be every single person. And that's just one example of like any intervention that can be done by people that aren't just your counselor, because Tacoma's in that same spot. We don't have enough counselors and social workers. We wish we had more, but there just isn't enough. We also just don't have enough money. And so like, how can other people implement an additional short, small, could be check and check out, who's all of the different people that could coordinate. It's not just one person, but it could be, you know, every teacher, it could be support staff, all of those things. Like we can't let our counselors be the only people. And that's why it's important to be a team, because then you can like discuss where is their capacity, where can you know, what little shift could you make? So
Yeah.
That's my other thought.
Next question is, what barriers are keeping Tacoma schools from allowing more in-school mental health treatment for students? Multiple surrounding school districts, and not just the ones in King County, have more on-site counselors and school-based health centers.
That is a good question. I think some of my Tacoma folks are here in the audience. Maybe they'll have a better answer to me. I feel like it comes a little bit back to money, that like we have received a grant to help support, but not all of the work that we want partner organizations, mental health organizations to do is billable. And so there needs to be funds to help with some of the other things that are happening. We've gained more grants, we've have more partnerships, but I think some of it is funds. I think some of it is just like the lack of amount of counselors, mental health supports nationwide. Tacoma's experiencing that too. Some people have openings for counselors, and it's just stayed open, like no one's there to fill it. We have counselors at every single one of our schools, but we don't have mental health counselors hired by the district. That's what we partner, and we're growing and growing, and I think looking for more money and ways to partner with people so that we can have more mental health support.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks, Christy. The last question is, what can we say instead of anti-racist? It's a phrase that triggers and divides. What's a strength-based alternative? I think for me, what I would say is maybe defining this in your organization. It's something that we value, right? And in Tacoma's community, it sounds like they value that as well. And we value anti-racism as well. So in our community, we don't look at it as dividing. But I would say, defining that within your organization and unpacking that a little bit more. Christy or Rayanne, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think similarly, I've heard people say, can we say anti-bias? But I think it's important for us, it's important for me to call out racism, and that we're all on the side of being anti-racist together and working on it together. It's like kind of having that growth mindset, like we want students to have growth mindset in classrooms, that we need to have growth mindsets. It's important for me to have a growth mindset about like, yes, how can I adjust? How can I grow? I'm still learning. So I think it really is important for us in Tacoma. We have an anti-racist policy in Tacoma that our board has passed. So it's really important for me to consider all forms of bias, and specifically racism, and how are we combating that. So I think it's a both and for us. Yeah.
Thank you. Also, someone typed that they wanted the CI3T website. I think I put it in there. It's ci3t.org, or if I'm wrong, you can just Google CI3T and it should pop up. for you to kind of review. They have a pretty comprehensive list of screeners. And pass it back over to you, Clynita.
Yes, thank you guys. Thank you so, so much. I love the discussion. I love how engaged everyone is, and it's hard to be engaged on Zoom. So thank you guys for your questions and your participation. Your feedback is important. So if you are wanting a certificate, please, please, please fill out this evaluation form so that you can have access to one or both of those certificates. Coming up, so remember, this is a multi-part series, and our next presenter is Dr. Nicole Holland Sims, who will be talking about fostering belonging in staff, recruitment and retention, and that will be January 17th. Yes, and again, Dr. Nicole Holland Sims will be back here in February. She'll talk about becoming the journey of a change agent, which is exciting. All right. Hey, and speaking of professional development and growing and learning more, there are some free online courses that the MHTTC is offering. And so if you're interested in these free online courses on health e-knowledge, please go to this website. Courses are free for certificate of completion, and there are yearly membership options for those who are interested in gaining access to other resources and unlimited, read my lips, unlimited CE credits. So if you have a license that you need to renew or a certificate that requires you to get CE credits, this is a wonderful way to go about doing that. And again, the goals of the free online courses are to expedite the adoption and implementation of EBPs, increase awareness, knowledge, and skills of the mental health workforce, and provide free, accessible training and technical assistance. And here are the contact information of our wonderful presenters today. And thank you, Mary, Rayanne, and Christy. And our last disclaimer is that the materials appearing in this presentation, except those that are taken directly from copyrighted sources, are public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA. The information in this presentation do not necessarily reflect, but here's our disclaimer. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. And here is ways in which you can contact us. Our website, our email address, and X, formerly known as Twitter. We hope to see you again in January. We hope that you have a wonderful winter break. Guys, we're at the countdown. We have one more month left before the winter break, and then we will start up and have a wonderful spring semester.
Thank you so much.